Our top focus this hour is the big news that's coming in from New York, where China has blocked the listing of Masood Azhar at the United Nations Security Council. Now, this is the fourth time that Beijing has blocked the bid to list the Jaish-e-Mohammad chief as a global terrorist. An hour before deadline, China placed a technical hold on the proposal moved by 3 permanent members of UN Security Council to list Jaish-e-Mohammad chief under the United Nations sanctions regime. The UN committee makes its decisions by consensus among its members. The proposal against Azhar had been moved by the United States, the United Kingdom and France after Jaish-e-Mohammad claimed responsibility for the Pulwama attack that killed 40 Indian security personnel in Kashmir. Now, China is a veto-wielding permanent member of the Security Council and an ally of Pakistan that has blocked India's proposal from being adopted by the Sanctions Committee. Now, Pakistan has been under growing international pressure to crack down on terror groups operating from its soil. The Pulwama attack led to the most serious escalation between India and Pakistan in recent years, with India conducting an airstrike on a JEM camp within Pakistan that was followed by an aerial engagement along the line of control from Pakistan. Now, Beijing's latest blocking to list Azhar raises questions about the apparent upswing in relations with New Delhi after last year's informal summit between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping at Wuhan. India's permanent representative to UN, Saeed Akbaruddin, has tweeted cryptically on China's decision, stating that only one big state has held up the listing of Masood Azhar. And to bring us more details and share their precious perspective, I'm joined in by our guests, Mr. Atul Aneja, China's correspondent for The Hindu. I'm also joined in by Mr. Vivek Karju, former India's ambassador to Afghanistan, and our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, who joins us live from New Delhi. A very warm welcome to all the three of you. Let's begin with Mr. Karju. Sir, how do you view China's stance at the moment? Isn't it reeking of double standards, especially when it comes to terrorism, and especially when China and the United States tom-tom about bringing peace and stability in the United States, in South Asia, sorry?
China's decision once again reinforces the view and the fact that all major countries, especially China, have adopted selective approaches when it comes to terrorism. China itself claims that it is a victim of terrorism from what it calls our Turkestani groups. And it presses upon the international community and countries, including India, not to have any dealings with these groups which operate in Xinjiang and elsewhere in China, even though many of the Turkestani people are peaceful and agitate peacefully. However, when it comes to India's concerns, China does not show the same consideration. It is time that we draw appropriate lessons from China's conduct, and certainly those people in India who believed that China was now beginning to show a greater consideration for India because of this meeting in Wuhan, which had taken place, should now reconsider their positions.
Absolutely. Ambassador, on that note, let me also go across to Atul Aneja, who's also joining us live. Atul, let me read out China's position at the moment. It says that China's position on Masood Azhar listing is consistent and India did not present updated materials. China-India relations should eye the big picture and not be disrupted by divergences over concrete issues. Now, what is the other concrete issue that China could be referring to that actually I fail to understand? Because considering what has happened between India and Pakistan of late, starting from Pulwama, is of course, is it not concrete enough, the issue of terrorism for China?
Well, the Chinese have been saying this, that they need a comprehensive solution, not just to Masood Azhar, but they're broadening the issue. I mean, that is what has been coming out from China. Definitely since Friday, when the foreign minister of China held a press conference, but more pointedly at the statement of the Chinese foreign ministry spokesman on Monday, and then again yesterday, that there needs to be a comprehensive solution to the crisis. So they are not going to be selective about isolating Masood Azhar issue with the other issues plaguing India-Pakistan relations. So I think that's a message which is coming out from China. But I think one thing new which has come out is from Friday's press conference, where for the first time, as far as I remember, the Chinese have used the word mediation in the context of India and Pakistan. They had not used this word earlier. And they also sent the special envoy, the vice foreign minister, to Pakistan. And also, I have learned that they had also sent a request to India for the vice foreign minister to visit. Obviously, this is a change which is coming out from China's position. And the point is that if China wants to mediate, then, just the position it has taken on Masood Azhar yesterday will not gel with India. So I'm a little surprised and also anticipate that this is not the end of the Chinese position on Masood Azhar. But as I said, they're broadening the issue and perhaps want a dialogue to build a consensus. There is no doubt now that from a Chinese perspective, Masood Azhar issue is a triangulated issue. It is not bilaterally between India and China, but also brings in Pakistan. So if India has to address it, I think the other vector also has to be addressed, which is the India-Pakistan element, if we need traction from China, specifically on the Masood Azhar issue.
Right. Mr. Nija has made a very, very valid point over there that China actually wants to mediate between India and Pakistan as it emerged out of the meeting on Friday. Let me go back to Ambassador Karju. Ambassador, what do you have to say? Because especially if mediation is a bone of contention between India and China at the moment, will yesterday's actions coming in from China actually go down well with India?
Look, India does not accept mediation between India and Pakistan. So I do think that China was unwise in using that word. And Atul is absolutely right. That is a word which had stood out in the Chinese statement and comments. And it was, since Chinese diplomacy is very deliberate, obviously this word was meant to give some support to their Pakistani friends. Clearly, China under President Xi is becoming an arrogant power, and it is not showing sensitivities to major powers like India.
True.
China, I think, has now to recognize that India is also a major power. It may not be as prosperous as China, but it has a standing in the world, and therefore to really triangulate issues is completely off the mark. This is not the way India will accept, and China should understand this. Unfortunately, it is still living in the past in these matters.
Right, Ambassador, the issue of, as you and Mr. Nija rightly mentioned, that China is triangulating this issue, and we will talk more about that. But for now, let's also run our viewers through India's reaction to the latest blockade that did not mention any names. But the Ministry of External Affairs issued a statement immediately after the proposal got blocked, stating that they are disappointed by the outcome and that this move has prevented action by the international community to designate Masood Azhar as a terrorist. The ministry also stated that they will continue to pursue all available avenues to ensure that terrorist leaders who are involved in heinous Pulwama attacks are brought to justice. In 2017, India indirectly identified China as the UNSC member responsible for blocking the consensus on listing Azhar. Now, the MEA had posted a statement in response to a query on Beijing's role, stating that they are deeply disappointed that a single country has blocked the listing of Masood Azhar again. Let me also bring in our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, who's joining us live at the moment from New Delhi. Siddhant, at the same time, I would like to hear it from you. Some two very pivotal developments have taken place. Yesterday in Washington, D.C. is when our Foreign Secretary, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, met with the Undersecretary, and some important developments took place there. And at the same time, there's a parallel development taking place on the Kartarpur corridor. Please go ahead and inform our viewers.
A lot of development taking place in just 2 hours from now. The Kartarpur talks will take place between India and Pakistani officials, but India has clarified that this is not a resumption of bilateral composite dialogue. And when it comes to the Indo-American relationship, we know the Foreign Secretary is in Washington. He met with the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He also met with NSA, American NSA Bolton, in which focus remained on the issue of terrorism emanating from Pakistan. And just in the last 15 minutes, we have seen reactions coming from US diplomats in New York saying that they might have to now look into different ways to make sure that justice is done. And of course, the issue of terror when it comes to Pakistan, there is some action. If China continues to block the entire listing of Masood Azhar, this is a strong statement coming from United States, and it clearly mentioned that Pakistan had been leaning over China when it comes to getting support at the United Nations Security Council. But here in Delhi, there is today a sense of betrayal from China, given the fact that in last year there was considerable bonhomie between the Indian leadership and, of course, the Chinese leadership. Both of them met for 4 times, starting with the Wuhan summit, informal summit, which took place last year. But today, it seems that the Wuhan spirit is no longer there, at least here in New Delhi, because of the Chinese betrayal.
Right, Siddhant. Let me go back to Mr. Arija at this moment. Mr. Arija, yesterday at the meeting that took place between India's Foreign Secretary, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, and the US Undersecretary, the 9th round of India-US Strategic Security Dialogue was held in Washington, D.C. And there were 2 very important points that I would like to mention. They committed to strengthen bilateral security as the establishment of 6 US nuclear power plants will be taking place in India. The other important point that emerges is the United States has reaffirmed its strong support to India's inclusion in the NSG. Now, this is again one important factor which China has, of course, been blocking. So, do you think that India's growing proximity with the United States is also becoming a bone of contention for China?
No, I don't think. I think Chinese know very well the limits to which the US is going to act to lean on Pakistan. Let us not forget that we have to understand the bigger picture. Because of Pakistan's geography and history, Pakistan is vital to Americans when it comes to Afghanistan. And we are having a phase of transition now taking place in Afghanistan, where Americans want to pull out and are deeply engaged with the Taliban, the talks in Qatar. They're deeply engaged with the Pakistanis. John Bolton had called Qureshi, the Pakistani foreign minister, just a day before yesterday. So there are certain dependency which has been created on the US by Pakistan. And because of that, because of the bigger picture which I've spoken, I do not think that the US is going to go beyond words and whatever it's doing now to address India's legitimate concern regarding Masood Azhar and terrorism radiated from Pakistan, which specifically targets India.
Right. Ambassador Karju, what would you like to say to this? That, you know, both the countries, be it China or the United States, have their dependency on Pakistan, while United States still went ahead with urging the other nations and other member nations to actually block. It was China that actually blocked Masood Azhar from being blacklisted at the UN sanctions list. So why this difference of opinion between China and the United States?
The interests of the United States and of China in Pakistan are quite different. In fact, I would even say radically different. Atul is right. The Americans need Pakistan as of now in the context of Afghanistan. And Pakistan's geography has always given it a certain leverage. But the Americans have a transactional relationship with Pakistan. As far as China is concerned, there are two aspects which are important. One is a shared continuing negativity towards India, shared between Pakistan and China. But second is a positive pillar to that relationship which started with the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And that is a very important aspect of China's Belt and Road Initiative.
True.
Hence, China's stakes in Pakistan are very, very deep. And the relationship, in fact, I would call it a nexus between the two countries against India, is something that we can never overlook.
All right. The nexus between China and Pakistan certainly seems to be something that we cannot overlook. On that note, US has also slammed China for blocking the listing of Masood Azhar, and US has issued a statement saying, and I quote, Pakistan has quite often depended on China to protect it from the listing of Pakistan-based terrorist groups and individuals in the UN 1267 Sanctions Committee. And the case for designating Masood Azhar, the leader of a group the UN already calls an Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist organization, is undeniable. Now, US has highlighted how this is the fourth time that China has placed a hold on the listing. US said, and I quote again, China should not prevent the committee from doing the job the Security Council has entrusted it to do. China's move to hold the listing is inconsistent with its own stated goals of combating terrorism and furthering regional stability in South Asia. If China is serious about these goals, it should not protect terrorists from Pakistan or any other country from being held accountable to the Council. If China continues to block the designation, responsible member states may be forced to pursue other actions at the Security Council. It shouldn't have to come to that. Let me bring in Siddhant Sibal, principal diplomatic correspondent on this. Siddhant, certainly a very stern and indeed a very deeply explanatory statement coming in from the United States.
Well, certainly a strong statement coming from Washington, and this also shows that not only Washington is backing New Delhi, but when it comes to opting between Beijing and New Delhi, Washington is clearly betting its bet on New Delhi. We know that New Delhi, Washington, Australia and Japan are part of the Quad, and this can get a fresh impetus after the developments which we saw in New York, because now, of course, New Delhi will be very, very off China and what is the Chinese motive behind the entire development. We know that China is considerably dependent when it comes to its connectivity projects through Pakistan, which of course is making Pakistan its own colony. Virtually, these are reports by Pakistani media, and the CPEC connects western part of the China to West Asia, and that is why China is kind of dependent when it comes to Pakistan, and that is why it seems that it's not able to take strong action on the issue of terror, especially terror based in Pakistan. But China needs to remember that these are terrorists who have been destabilizing the region, whether it comes to Afghanistan, Iran or India, and these terrorists can one day impact China as well.
Right. Also, let me go across to Mr. Atul Aneja for more on China at the moment. Mr. Aneja, do you think that China also relies on Pakistan for its support that it receives from Pakistan at the OIC, be it China's crackdown on the Uyghur Muslims or China's backlash that it's been receiving over its actions over the South China Sea? Pakistan has been playing a very protective role at the countries which are involved in the non-aligned movement, the NAM to say. Do you think that China also relies on Pakistan for that global support it receives at the NAM or the OIC?
No, I don't think China has any critical dependence on Pakistan on any of these forums, especially the fact that when it comes to OIC countries, China generally have excellent bilateral relations with each of them. So apart from symbolic reasons, it's not important for Pakistan. But I go back to Vivek's point. I think what is of critical importance is for CPEC. To add to that is also that Pakistan gives, in a strategic sense, access to the Indian Ocean. Now, if you really look at from a Chinese perspective, it has a huge problem in the West Pacific, where it is surrounded by what is called the first island chain, which stretches down to Japan and extends down up to Malaysia. And its access to the Malacca Straits can be compromised because of the U.S. domination of the state. So China needs an outlet to the Indian Ocean to bypass its vulnerabilities in the Pacific. And it does through either now buddingly through Myanmar and through Pakistan. So those are very pressing strategic issues, the BRI and access to Indian Ocean, which sort of create this extraordinary bond, to put it that way, between China and Pakistan. Where I will disagree slightly with Vivek is on the nexus between China and Pakistan against India. Now, I think that's going a bit too far, because from a Chinese point of view, especially after a low-intensity Cold War has started with the United States, which is reflected through trade wars and technology wars, the attacks on Huawei, etc., China does not want that in this emerging new Cold War, India joins the so-called Quad, which is the Americans, Australians, Japanese, etc. So there are pressing strategic reasons which are also emerging, which China realizes, of engagement with India. So that gives room for some flexibility. As of now, the Pakistan side is weighing more heavily in the Chinese discourse. But I do see over time that the hard realities of the overall global situation changing will cause China to balance out its relation in the long run between Pakistan and India. But the immediacy of the other issue is not reflected, will not get reflected in this broad trends which are emerging.
Right.
But over time, there is no other option for China when it comes, because its problem will be with the US, to have a more nuanced relationship in the subcontinent.
All right.
No, BRI is only a means of China acquiring its own quote-unquote colonies. All major countries, especially countries which have aspirations to superpower status, and China does have it. It now considers itself to be in the same bracket as the United States, as a kind of G2, replacing the Soviet Union of the old days. And therefore, just as the Soviet Union had a Warsaw Pact and the Americans had their alliance, China, through the BRI, wants to acquire that kind of following among countries. And naturally, India can have no truck with this, apart from the fact that the CPEC completely overlooks India's legitimate sovereignty concerns. The Chinese are especially sensitive on these matters, but when it comes to sensitivities of other countries, the Chinese historically have shown no concern. And therefore, I say we must draw appropriate lessons. Two other points I'd like to make. One is that the Chinese, yes, in the long term, they may, some of their observers and some members of their security classes may feel the need not to alienate India completely so that it is pushed in the so-called American camp. But certainly none of their actions on India's core concerns have as yet shown a kind of consideration which India can buy. The Prime Minister made a great deal of effort. He expended enormous political capital in going to Wuhan. Today, how will he be feeling when on a concern like this, when he is facing elections? The Chinese have completely shown insensitivity. My second point, it should not be a case, as the saying goes, muddai sust gawah chust. The Americans are going all out mentioning China. Why should we, who have a principal concern regarding Masood Azhar, a country that is facing a direct impact of his activities, losing precious lives of our young men, show diffidence in even mentioning China by name in our statement? I don't understand this kind of diplomacy. We should be forthright in saying that we are disappointed that China has held this up.
That's a
point
very valid point made by you, Ambassador, over there, that we should not be shying away from naming China for this. Ambassador Karju, you made a very valid point that brings me back to you, that India should have been more forthright. Do you think that China's intransigence in backing Pakistani terrorists is going to finally affect what was achieved between India and China at Wuhan?
I do think that the Chinese should realize that the Wuhan spirit cannot only be maintained by one side alone. India has shown amazing consideration of Chinese interests, for example, when the Tibetans are concerned. Indeed, I feel that perhaps we've gone too far. We've bent backwards to accommodate Chinese interests in this regard. But has China shown the same consideration for our core concerns? Never. Yes, Chinese strategists may say that ultimately they'll have a balance in their relationship between India and Pakistan, but Chinese strategists should realize that they cannot bracket India and Pakistan anymore. India is today a global power. It may not be of the same status economically as China, but India has a position in the globe. And this China does not want to accept entirely. Because China under the present president, President Xi Jinping, has imperial ambitions. There's no other word for it. Howsoever they may wish to cloak it, but they are showing these imperial ambitions, and we need to take note and state it forthrightly. Subtleties may be all right at some stage, but a flash of white has to be shown sometime, and that should be shown at this juncture. I do think that very strongly.
Right. Let me bring in Mr. Aneja on this. Mr. Aneja, what do you have to say? Do you think that India should be more forthright in expressing its angst towards China?
I think India has to be completely focused on the goal, the objective, which is elimination of terrorism that targets India from Pakistani soil. That is the strategic objective. The rest is tactics, and that depends on the situation. When it comes, Vivek had mentioned about India being extraordinarily accommodative when it came to Wuhan and Wuhan spirit, etc. I agree with him. But to say that that has not yielded results would be, in my view, equally incorrect. If today China is on board on the Financial Action Task Force, it is the result of this quiet behind the scenes of diplomacy which took place, a transactional approach which India and China adopted, which resulted in something very tangible. Today, Pakistan is grey listed and is in mortal danger of being blacklisted by FATF, which means the rating agencies lower Pakistan's rating. It can be an economically crippling blow for Pakistan, and that will be a huge gain for India. But that has not happened by any kind of grandstanding or any kind of so-called forthrightness of naming and shaming China, but through very patient and focused diplomacy which has gone on behind the scenes. I would suggest that being clinically focused on our objectives, we should continue to engage with China while keeping up our powder dry and working on multiple tracks. I do not for a moment say that we should not pursue the thing like airstrikes in Balakot. Our military dimension, keeping our power dry, keeping a nuclear triad, forest checking strike capability is as important as this focused diplomacy that we require, and keep engaged with China on this.
All right.
And we have to be patient on this.
All right.
So I think be focused on the core objective. Tactics varies according to situation.
Okay, focus on the core objective and tactics shall vary. But I also have Ambassador Karju. He would like to make a point over here. Ambassador, please go ahead.
I agree entirely that we should focus on the core objective. At the end of the day, that core objective we will have to achieve ourselves. Neither China, nor the United States, nor anyone else would come to our assistance. We have to meet Pakistan's challenge of terrorism by ourselves, and unfortunately, we have had lack of clarity for 3 decades on how to meet it. But that's a separate point. As far as the Chinese are concerned, on the FATF, I would beg to differ with Atul. The Chinese too have concerns on Pakistani terror, and perhaps it is these concerns that are being reflected in the FATF. The Chinese know what Pakistan is all about, and they have concerns with regard to Xinjiang and the Turkestani groups. But there is also another dimension, and which is that the Chinese are also showing concern to American interests on this. So it's not India which is propelling them on the FATF. Quiet diplomacy, my final point, quiet diplomacy doesn't mean that you don't name and shame a country. The Chinese have never been reluctant in doing so. Why use the word mediation when they would have known that it is a red rag to India and to Indian diplomats? This is a two-way street. The Chinese must understand this, that if they use words which can inflame Indian opinion, then India will do so too.
All right, Ambassador, some very fair points made by you over there. It's also important at this junction to actually bring in the United States comments that have slammed China for blocking the listing of Azhar, as US has issued a statement saying, and let me quote, Pakistan has quite often depended on China to protect it from the listing of Pakistan-based terrorist groups and individuals in the UN 1267 Sanctions Committee. Now, the case for designating Masood Azhar, the leader of a group the UN already calls an Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist organization, is undeniable. Now, US highlighted how this is the 4th time that China has placed a hold on the listings. US said, and I quote, China should not prevent the committee from doing the job the Security Council has entrusted it to do. China's move to hold the listing is inconsistent with its own stated goals of combating terrorism and furthering regional stability in South Asia. If China is serious about these goals, it should not protect terrorists from Pakistan or any other country from being held accountable to the Council. Now, if China continues to block the designation, responsible member states may be forced to pursue other actions at the Security Council. It shouldn't have to come to that. Well, that's what United States had to say. Let me take my next question from Ambassador Karju. Ambassador, what do you think could India and the UNSC now do to further blacklist Masood Azhar on the UN sanctions list?
Well, I don't see any possibility under the 1267 regime. I'm not aware of any other instrumentalities that can be used within the UN system. But certainly certain bilateral and multilateral approaches can be examined between India and a group of countries with this regard. That may weaken the 1267 system. And perhaps that is what the Americans are hinting at, that if China blocks this time and again, as it has done for a decade, and the world is convinced on Masood Azhar, it's a separate matter whether listing by itself is effective.
True.
Indeed, the Chinese should know it is not effective, but out of consideration for this abiding friendship with Pakistan that they do this. Well, then they must know that they will be bypassed in some ways. And
right.
We should encourage that.
Right. Mr. Aneja, do you think there is any possible way out within the UN system for India to approach again and for other countries?
No, I doubt. I agree with Vivek on that. I think the UN system does not, we are not Security Council members to do anything. So I don't think the UN system will work beyond a point. But I also have my grave concerns about getting into an arrangement such as a coalition of the willing, American-led coalition outside the UN system. I think we have seen numerous international examples of this, that how it has boomeranged so badly as it has done in the case of Iraq and other places in the Middle East. So I do not think we should go on that track. I do agree with one suggestion which came from Vivek, which is that we've got to take out our chestnuts from the fire ourselves. If we can do something, we can do something about Masood Azhar within the range of our capabilities. I think we should go ahead and do that and take concrete action rather than depending. Diplomacy has its own limits. Beyond a point, there are other instruments of power which you need to deploy. And to deploy, keeping in mind its overall fallout, whether that fallout is in India's national interest or not. I think that's the approach. As I said, clinically look at the problem. I remember after IC-814, the Kandahar hijacking, there was a point when our system was looking at an option against Masood Azhar after he was released. Unfortunately, the government of the day did not accept it. But I think those are the kind of areas which we should be looking at, taking unilateral action at times, or thinking about or considering and planning that rather than looking at a multilateral militaristic or quasi-military approach outside the UN system. I think that is highly, highly dangerous thing to do. It will co-opt us into an alliance partnership with the United States, which I think country after the 1998 nuclear test, having acquired strategic autonomy, should keep far away from.
All right, to end with, let me also take my last question from Mr. Kaju. Ambassador, today, as we all know, India and Pakistan will be meeting to discuss modalities on the Kartarpur corridor. That's another development I would like to speak to you. And just ahead of this meeting, Imran Khan met with the Khalistan ideologue Gopal Chawla, raising Pakistan's Khalistan propaganda as also another aspect to the entire Khalistan corridor, Kartarpur corridor. Do you think that the Kartarpur corridor talks should be going ahead at this juncture?
Akanksha, I'll come to that, but permit me 2 sentences on what
Please go
Atul
ahead.
said. I'm not suggesting military alliances, far from it. I'm suggesting a kind of listing mechanism through a multilateral approach. There's nothing wrong with diplomatically. After all, you list people. And then a group of countries comes together and says, we will not allow Masood Azhar to come to our countries. We demand that his assets be seized. Things like that are perfectly reasonable. And it is not compromising our basic position that we will not get into or entangle ourselves into unnecessary alliances. Now, to come back to Kartarpur, look, the very fact that Imran Khan met the Khalistani shows the actual motivations of Pakistan into showing this consideration on Kartarpur. It is connected with their Khalistani approaches. We should never forget that. Our Sikh community is a patriotic community. It will never get seduced by Pakistani approaches. However, we cannot overlook that Pakistan will continue to make this effort substantively as well as for propaganda purposes. Now, to your last question, I do think that government would have considered very carefully whether it should postpone the 14th meeting. But, Akanksha, we are in an election season. Let us not forget that.
True. That's in a very subtle and a very smart way you've put it across. We are in an election season. Thank you so much, Ambassador Kaju and Mr. Anija, for joining us live from New Delhi and Beijing and sharing your precious perspective.